Welcome to CONEXEC, a global leadership platform for construction executives. This podcast is delivered weekly, featuring construction executives. Today, I have Tim Phillips with me here today. And how are you doing this morning, Tim?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing well. And rather me, go through all your history and everything. And I can tell that you're a humble guy because you don't brag on yourself too much here. But you have a pretty interesting history, Tim. So can you kind of walk us through, where you're at now and kind of go, or take you from where you started to where you're at now?
Sure. Well, I'm a graduate of Arizona University with a civil engineering degree. Strangely enough, 40 years ago, it was in 1980. It seems like, golly, I'm not that old. But graduated with an engineering degree from Arizona State University. Most of my career has been with public sector, mostly water resources field, but within that sector, obviously, lots of infrastructure construction. I've worked with irrigation companies, flood control districts, and the last position, I was the chief engineer and general manager for the flood control district of Maricopa County. Worked with them for 17 years, was chief engineer for 10 years, building flood control infrastructure in Maricopa County here in Arizona. The other thing is I got commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Arizona National Guard in 1979 and branched Army Corps of Engineers and had a tremendous career, kind of the dual career of was 31 years in the Guard, retired as a brigadier general, and just a tremendous opportunity to play the civilian engineering construction role against the military engineering construction role, and then leadership on both sides. So I've had a very, very blessed career in that sense, to kind of dual-hatted and being able to play both. Another thing that I was adjunct faculty at Arizona State University in their School of Business for a couple years, teaching leadership to graduating business students, which I thought was incredibly fascinating, and kind of kind of taught me that, there's a lot of really, really good kids that are coming up in the world that have a lot of potential. And I was really, really impressed with that. It was a really good group. So currently I'm working for Caruso, is a small vertical construction contractor in Scottsdale, and a number of projects all over central and northern Arizona. It's a growing company, growing pretty quick, which has, of course, the growing pains that probably most construction companies that are in a growth mode. So I could say I've had a really wonderful career and a lot of opportunities.
So when you were with the National Guard, does it come to a point, because I have a gentleman that works with me here, does it get to a point where it becomes like a full-time gig, or, once you get to a senior level position?
Well, I always felt, as an officer in the Guard or in the military, I never thought of it. I always hated the term weekend warrior related to it, because I found that if you're going to do the proper job, it becomes essentially a second job. You're not doing it full time. You have resources to help you, but your perspective has to be what are you planning for the next opportunity to get your soldiers together and train. And so throughout my career, I always thought of my role in the National Guard as really a second job, not a hobby or just something I did on the side. I think if you're going to lead, you got to be present to lead, and you got to be there, even if you're not sitting in the chair full time. You got to act like you are, to do justice to the soldiers you're training.
I always think that's interesting because it's got to be tough. I mean, me being I'm retired Navy, which I'm sure an Army guy like you would have some choice things to say. But the fact
Oh,
is
thank you for your service. That's what I'll say.
so the but I always thought how tough it would be when I was, active duty, and how tough it would be to juggle having a civilian job with being in the military too, because it's like, you're being pulled different ways. And I thought that was kind of an interesting concept. Although I've encouraged my son to join the National Guard because it is really, I mean, as far as helping young people out, and it kind of gives the best of both worlds a little bit, gives them a chance to do multiple different things.
It certainly teaches you a skill set. And for me, uh, my very first drill with the National Guard, I'm standing in front of 45 soldiers that are my responsibility. So you're immersed in leadership responsibilities at a young age, and I found that to be, while challenging at times, because most of those folks were senior to me. Uh, you learn leadership styles and how do you get the best out of folks at a very early age. So to me, the dual career was a perfect setup for me, and I would recommend your son certainly get into the Guard. It's a skill set, not to mention service to the country.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it sounds like you, because I also taught at a university for a period of time, and it sounds like, I know for me it was kind of an extension of being in the service, serving something greater than yourself. And I loved it. I taught for a decade, and I could see that you have a love for that too, because it is like a love for service.
Absolutely, and be able to influence. I kind of believe in what I call the "It's a Wonderful Life" syndrome. You've seen the movie, you don't know who you affect and how you affect them, and the ability to influence, these students coming out of college. And you probably remember when you were there, you didn't really know where you were going or what you were doing. To be able to influence them and say, I hope I've given you something you're going to remember 5 years from now. That's a plus. And I used to kid with them. In 5 years, if you're using something that you taught in class and you make it big, like red Ferraris,
Yeah.
feel free. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Tell us about Caruso as a company. What's their history, kind of background about them?
well, we're a general contractor in Arizona. Done some work in California, predominantly private side work. The great claim to fame is really golf course, clubhouse, and community center renovations. Been in the industry since '93, but has expanded to public sector work, plus the private sector work.
Hmm.
Probably the only thing that Caruso self-performs is paint. We have a paint division, and so it's the and it's growth. It's a growing company. Each year we've done a little bit better. The economy comes up and goes down, but right now construction is still strong. The biggest challenge is construction is so strong that trying to line up subcontractors is a unique experience, because in the Phoenix Valley, there's a tremendous amount of work being done, but we do predominantly private sector with some public sector work. In fact, the biggest project that we have that I'm acting as a project executive and project manager on is a federal project up in Flagstaff at an old Army depot, which is interesting because the way I came about being Caruso is I was the director of the ordnance operation at Camp Navajo for 3 years, and Caruso rebuilt two of the legacy magazines to hold rocket motors for me then, and now we're doing 10 more, and I'm the project manager for it. So it's kind of like I was, now I'm the constructor. It's a
it's a small
unique
world.
bird. Yeah, it is.
Well, so the focus of the company has mostly been private, but they've expanded out to be more to do public work also.
I mean, where we see, we look at both sides of the story. Obviously, public sector work is, you go find it on the various government websites. Much of it's, CMAR or hard bids.
Mm-hmm.
Public sector is, or the private sector is sort of just the opposite. Kind of like, who do you know? How do you make the contact? How do you get out there and market business development? It's a little bit slower to develop because it's very, very much more about relationships. So I find that for somebody who's been on the owner's side, it's kind of a fascinating difference in how you go about business.
So what got you to? I mean, you've had a long, distinguished career. What got you to jump on with Caruso? Um, in general, besides the fact that you probably go crazy, you're sitting at home.
Well, that's probably more the truth than anything else. I think the coronavirus, staying at home was kind of the rehearsal to retirement for me, and I don't think I want to do that. So I was living up in Flagstaff and had some challenges that I had to move back down to the valley, and so I had talked with, as I said, Chris Caruso, who's the owner of Caruso Construction, because he had done work for me up there, and he said, "Hey, why don't you come work with us for a while?" So it was probably more an opportunity than anything else. It's interesting. I found in my career, both civil and military, that I never had a plan. That it was just opportunities and making myself, doing the schooling, doing the different things that you needed to be able to get opportunities. But those that I knew that saw things in me gave me all of my opportunities. I almost found that if I applied for the job, that was the kiss of death. It was who you knew, the relationships that you built that gave you opportunities. And so here coming to Caruso, a little bit out of my comfort zone, doing vertical construction, because between flood control and irrigation, it's all horizontal construction. But it was also a great opportunity to grow, do something that I hadn't done before, learn some new skills, and it's been an interesting journey.
Well, and the funny thing is that the skills that you do have, that obviously I would have to say don't just have, you have a master of the ability to plan and motivate people and coordinate. Those things, transcend any industry. Yes, there's some nuances between vertical and horizontal, but obviously the most important thing is to have a team put together, because like you guys are you guys only self-perform paint. You can't be an expert in everything, so you got to really
Right.
depend upon others.
And so as I've gotten to this part of my career, to me, it's very, very much about leadership and about how you exercise leadership. How do you get the most out of folks? I have a lot of phrases that I've over my career, and the one that, it's like when I was teaching leadership, the final was really the 10 notes that I've assembled over the course of my career. But the military taught me, one of their slogans was, mission first, people always. And I think that is so important. You can't do any task without the people, but the people are the most challenging of any job, because we all have different perspectives. And so the value of strong leadership, leadership that knows what they want to do and how to treat people, motivate people, recognizing that every employee is different and responds to different perspectives. But if you want to build the team, you as a senior leader have to be able to figure that out, and you have to know fundamentally where you're going. People follow somebody who knows where they're going, even if it's wrong. But people follow.
Absolutely.
You can't stand back and expect things to happen. So there was a guy that I worked for at the flood control district that I took over after him as the chief engineer. And I said, Mike, how do I get your job? And I was a project manager at the time. And he said, you got to have vision. You got to know where you're going. And then you've got to be able to articulate that to the folks that you work with. And so, my journey has really taken me very much to the leadership aspect of good organizations, and what's good organizational management, and how do you another one of the phrases was you lead people and you manage things. If you try to manage people, like budgets and things like that, it doesn't work. People, and so very much leadership is, it's very easy to see where there's strong leadership, very easy to see where there's poor leadership. And I think many organizations that fail is fundamentally a failure of leadership. And we know that, there are leaders and bad leaders, but I'm convinced everybody can be taught leadership. It's not something you're given, you either have or you don't, but you have to want to. And as we talked about early on when we talked about military service, leadership is about selfless service. It's what are you doing, across the board that's selfless. If you're a selfish leader and it's about you, every one of your employees sees that, and you don't get the best that you can get out of the folks that you're trying to take this journey with.
And that's what the incredible part for me is that, no matter if you say it or not, what's important to you is what is communicated through your actions, So you don't have to say anything, but if, just by your actions alone, I have to say that's one thing I learned from the military was people are more concerned about what you do than what you say.
Absolutely. You have to model, when I taught leadership at ASU, I said, at the end of the day, look at the people that you admire as leaders and model their skill set, and look at those that you think do a really crappy job and are poor leaders and don't do what they're doing. If at the end of the day, use what you have around you and just be conscious and aware of it. That talking down to your employees consistently is not a good trait. Demanding a certain level of performance is. There's nothing wrong with that. And the subtlety is how do you do that? But, look at the good leaders and model their behavior, and look at the bad leaders and don't do what they do.
What significant event happened, kind of in your career that has kind of shaped who you are today?
Well, that's sort of I've thought about that. It's an interesting question because there have been really so many things. I've been given opportunity, had people that saw things that they saw in me and gave me opportunity. To be honest, my wife, who passed away a couple years ago, we were married 30 years. She was the greatest influence in my life. She gave me, and she would say that when we first met, I was kind of that military guy, do it my way or the highway. And she really taught me that there's a whole lot more to the equation than that, and that it's really all about people. So if there was a significant influence in my life, it had to be her. And it was funny. She used to kid with me that, when I got promoted to 1-star, she said, well, make no mistake that if you have 1 star, I have 2 stars. And the sooner I realized that it was good. But there were a number of people that, like I said, there wasn't one significant event because career kind of went in a lot of different paths. But it was based on people pushing me to get the credentials that I needed, to learn my craft, to be able to talk in front of people, to have vision. They set me up for the success that I've had. And when I've taught leadership and people say, what's your model for leadership? I have a little model that I put together, and it has to do with the first thing you do is become the subject matter expert, your skill set, your craft. And the second big piece that typically comes after is take any opportunity to present, to stand in front of people, to be able to talk, because if you can't convey your perspective, then you're sort of sunk, right? Mm-hmm. So anytime you do presentations, anytime you stand in front of people, you've got to do. The third piece I talked about was vision, and that kind of comes later. If you got to have a vision, if you can articulate it and you know what you're talking about, then you have kind of the base leadership success. Whether it's environment or timing, you never have control over the environment or the timing that you got to make a decision. So set yourself up with the skill set, ability to articulate, and then the ability to have vision. And I wish I had known that. Coming out of engineering school, of course, they don't teach you anything about those sort of life skills. And I've often thought, well, I'd like to get back into school and teach the engineering students about leadership and about that perspective. I think that'd be an incredible opportunity. But
and what's interesting about that is they obviously, for good reason, schools that teach engineering are focused on math and and statics and dynamics and those things, those technical things, which are very important, but yet probably the most important thing is the ability to lead the people, is something that kind of gets left by the wayside. So
absolutely. And I thought one course in an 120-hour curriculum on leadership that just maybe gives a little bit of a perspective sets them up better for the life skills.
Well, I want to let you know, sorry to hear about your wife. I do, my wife came down with cancer a few years ago, with breast cancer a few years ago. And I know that it was kind of a life-changing experience for me, because, you think you always have tomorrow, but tomorrow is not promised to anybody, So, and one of the things that David Dean said, which was one of my guests way back and a friend of mine, he said, choose wisely when you choose a spouse, because that's the person that's going to either help you or hurt you. And that's true. I mean, without my wife on my side, I would not have been able to accomplish what I've been able to accomplish. So
absolutely. And it's the support and having somebody else to be able to talk about things and talk through things is important, which is very similar to having a good management team or leadership team in an organization. If you're all off your own thing, you're not collaborating, and you need the diversity of perspectives to make good decisions. You also need to be able to make the decision. Any decision is better than no decision, I was taught a long time ago. But you fundamentally need the people to influence you to make the best decisions. I firmly believe that.
So if you were to say personally what skills and abilities that you have that have had you be consistently successful, and I know you touched a little bit on this, but that have made you consistently successful while in the military and working in the civilian world. And if for those of you who haven't served in the military, it's a when I say a big deal, it is a big deal when you pick up a star. And if you're not in the military, you probably don't understand how big of a deal that is, but that's a big deal. And obviously you have some skills and ability that are unique or are special. And what do you think those are if you had to pick them out?
Well, it's sort of strange that you ask the question that way, because I don't know that I have any unique abilities or skills. And maybe it's that again, I talked about opportunity. Part of opportunity was the willingness to go try new things, to continue to grow, obviously taking the initiative, making decisions and learning from your failures. I don't know that I'm any more unique than anybody else, Maybe it's just in perspective. That's why I say I think anybody can be successful in their career, but they have to. Part of it is truly balancing: are you task oriented or are you people oriented? And either end of the spectrum isn't necessarily good. You got to place yourself somewhere in the middle.
Mm-hmm.
You can't. I think if there was one word, it was probably just awareness of what is going on around you. You know, how people are. You know, are you perspective? Can you sense where they want to go? And then can you look at a job? You know, when I graduated from engineering school, I think it taught me three things. It taught me the language of engineering. It taught me the logical thought, you know, to work through problems. And it taught me the references where to go get information. And that was fundamentally it. 4 years
Mm-hmm.
engineering school taught me that. I think it's just leveraging that, always being willing to try something new, uh, always being willing to learn. And then, you know, I suppose there's an element of luck, and that's hooking yourself up with good people. You know, somebody told me once, you know, if you want to be successful, surround yourself with successful people. And I think that that's important too. So I guess it's hard for me to say that there was one particular event or one particular skill set that got me here. I think it was more just the journey of, you know, taking advantage of opportunities when I had. Of course, you know, hard work and, you know, quantity and quality of work always makes a difference. But also, you know, as I got older and older, it was really more about the people, about the folks that you were doing things for and the people that you were doing things with, uh, and just having a perspective about that. I wish there was one unique answer to that, but for me, it's just been a combination of lots of things.
Well, you mentioned in humility about luck, and I always tell people, I tell my kids all the time, you know, luck is really the intersection of preparedness and opportunity, you know? So being prepared
Absolutely.
and having the opportunity available, and obviously you can't bet them on the opportunity, but you got to prepare that there could be one. And the other thing is just looking through your career, and I talked to once again I talked to my kids and I talked to my you know, all my people about this. Is it doesn't appear based on your career that you are a risk adverse person. You know, you're willing to roll the dice because you have confidence that that if you try something new, you can be successful, and you're okay with the thought of, hey, if I fail, that's okay. You know, so can you
Well,
talk
I
about
think,
that?
yeah, I'm probably a fairly conservative person, and sometimes I think, you know, maybe I could have made much more of my career than I did. But you're right. You have to be willing to grow, and you have to be willing to try new things. And part of trying new things is, like you said, doing the preparation so that you're not going in totally blind, but at least you have an idea.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but it's always it's risk that's managed. You know, I don't know that I was ever at a point where I just say, okay, I don't like what I'm doing today. I'm quitting and going and trying something new. Uh, but it's you know, I'm trying to find the right words for it. I think it's just looking for being willing to try things and pushing the envelope and asking the tough questions. And you know, there were folks through my career that, you know, there were some that loved me and some that hated me. But at the end of the day, I was always an ethical person, moral and ethical person. And while they, you know, while they may not have liked what I did or the decision I made, they knew it was in the best interest of the organization, and we were moving forward. Uh, and found that to be very successful. Sometimes being able to make a hard decision is important. Again, making no decision gets you nowhere. So
Well, at at the level that you're at, most decisions that can be solved or more issues can be solved at a lower level, uh, are real easy, already taken care of. So you get handed issues, and I'm sure you saw this in your career, that are far more complex and don't necessarily get you a lot of fans. You know.
Oh, absolutely. But I found, talking about construction in particular, at the flood control district, we were very aggressive on partnering with our contractors. We were the owner, and we had a partnership relationship and I strongly believe, even here at Caruso, in partnering, that you become one team as opposed to a them and us. Mm-hmm. And I think that was huge. And part of that was how you escalated issues. And I was always a big fan, before we and the contractor, the owner and the contractor, are pointing fingers and blaming at each other, that means it's gone too far down the road. Mm-hmm. We should be talking about it much earlier. And engineers fundamentally want to solve the problem. But, what was it that Patton said? The good plan violently executed is better than the perfect plan too late.
Yeah.
Engineers will study something to death at times. And so part of it's being able to make the right decision at the right time, but partnering with your contractors where you have an agreement of how you're going to disagree, and then the mechanism to move forward. But fundamentally, at the end of the day, it's just not about a them and us. It's about a we put together a project that served the public good. And I think too often we lose sight of the relationship that we have with our contractors or subcontractors. And at the end of the day, again, it's all about relationships.
That's what's so funny with technology today and everything that we have in place and contracts and everything. At the end of the day, it still comes down to relationships.
Like I said, the Army had their slogan that said, "Mission first, people always."
So tell me, do you have any specific failures or successes in your career that you could point to that you learned some good lessons from? Because everybody likes to hear stories. So,
I think we've had our failures where we made the wrong decision at the wrong time, or sometimes didn't act when we should. But strangely enough, I can't say that I had a failure, something that just went absolutely wrong, because I think once you figure out that it went wrong, you figure out how to fix it. Maybe that's a skill set, but there was a project that I had at the flood control district, a vision that I had, and it was called, and I bring this up, it's the best project I ever came up with that was a failure. And what I mean by that is, Maricopa County in central Arizona is the confluence of all the river systems for the lower 2/3 of Arizona. And the river systems here have been, some have been mined out. And so there's been big federal dollars put in place to mitigate that. There are other rivers that are pristine, and then there's some that are in between. And I had this vision of what I called healthy rivers. And how do you work the corridors through a river system and evaluate them? So you have the water corridor that talks about recharge and flood control, and then you have the recreational corridor, and you have the biological corridor and the development corridor. And how do you manage these different corridors? What has already been done, and what needs to be done so that you don't break a river and have to spend endless taxpayer dollars to fix it? Mm-hmm. And I think conceptually, it was the right thing to do. Within the Phoenix area, they have the mountain preserves, so call it the river preserves. How do you maintain these corridors, which are fundamentally recreation and biological and infrastructure corridors? And it was the one thing, I suppose, in myself, was a failure of leadership, because I just wasn't able to articulate it well enough and convince people that influence people that this was something that wasn't it was just something to work on, a vision to work on, that's good for the community. And sure, there'll be lots of challenges with it, And so if I had a failure, that was it, that I just didn't have the wherewithal at the time to be able to to get that where it started to grow roots and legs and could take off. And I still think it's a great concept, but I don't know that I had the ability or the influence to make it happen. And that's unfortunate.
What about, well, that's a tough thing, because at that level, your ability to influence people is these are decision makers, and the public all together, much larger, much more difficult, something to navigate. Very political, I'm sure, so,
Of course.
what about, can you point to any, talk about maybe a story of a success that you had that, and kind of just talk about that in general?
For example, it's more of a leadership success, but it was infrastructure driven. When at the Army depot that's up in Flagstaff, it's a old installation built in 1942, and an active duty installation that was let go by the Army in the early 80s because of the BRAC, the Base Reduction and Closure Act.
Mm-hmm.
And so the active duty mission went elsewhere, but it still stayed as a training mission for the Arizona National Guard on the installation, and 28,000 acres. So it was a big installation. When the Army came in 1942, selected an Army depot, needed to build 18 depots across the country. In 9 months, they built, again, 28,000 acres, 777 magazines, 38 miles of rail. And when I talk about magazines, arch culvert, explosive bunkers,
mm-hmm.
And 250 miles of road. So when I was at Camp Navajo I went there in 2014. The industrial operation needed some perspective, and the goal of the industrial operation, basically using all of this legacy infrastructure to store munitions for federal entities, but it was a state business enterprise. It had no federal or state dollars associated with it. It was, you make money off of labor and storage, and then you reinvest that in the installation. And the success was being able to bring some consistency to the operation financially, to understand. Well, I became a firm believer that if you start an organization, you need to know 3 things. You need to know the people, you need to know how the money flows, and you need to know what your authorities are. And so with that, I was able to put together a really good organization that was serving the Navy and the Air Force in storing ballistic rocket motors, doing working with Raytheons to store and making money to be able to reinvest in infrastructure on the installation, roads, buildings, utilities, and it took a lot of leadership, it took a lot of knowledge, and it took a lot of people willing to see a vision, and we had a great operation.
That's an interesting kind of business model there,
it is.
Go ahead.
I was going to say very much so, to use infrastructure that the Army no longer needed, that was falling apart, to be used to reinvest in the national defense by doing something for federal entities, was really an incredible opportunity. And doing it as a state business enterprise, where it's about as close to a private company, but under a government oversight, was an incredible opportunity. A lot of very good people and a very, very unique mission in redoing 1942 infrastructure for a 2020 mission.
Kind of going back to, and I want to frame this in a way that really is applicable to you, because you were a teacher at one point. If you were to go back to ASU and you had to give a personal word advice to those engineering or construction students graduating to go out into industry, and they want to pursue a senior level position within the organization, they're serious about their career, what kind of advice would you give to those people, and then also maybe to the mid-career people that want to go to that next level within their career?
It's the same, and I talked a little bit about it. At both levels, it's really the same. It's know your craft. Every opportunity to learn the presentation skills, to be able to talk to people one-on-one in small groups, and stand in front of people in a large group. And then the third is have a vision, know where you want to go, be able to dream, be able to put your feet up on the table and let your mind wander so you can figure out where you need to be ahead of what you're doing right now. And those three skill sets that typically in a career kind of come in progressive order are I think critical. I think probably if I was going to say the most important of those is your ability to talk to folks. And I know when I first got promoted to general, the 2-star said to me, Tim, you got to be able to stand in front of people and be able to talk like you know what you're talking about, and be able to influence them and direct them anytime, any place, anywhere. And so that skill set to me is for the younger generation that is maybe so much involved in social media and not the face-to-face interaction as much as probably you and I were growing up. The ability to talk to people at all levels is a must-do. People won't follow somebody unless they can stand up in front of them and tell them where they're going.
Hey, that's some excellent advice. So to close this out, I want to kind of get from you. I mean, kind of people, you kind of told your story here, and I think it's interesting for everyone to kind of rank these different topics, and it's just interesting how different people view things that are important or not. And so I'm going to go through some topics, and I want you to grade them on 1 to 10, 10 being the most important, 1 being the least important. Now all of them could be 10, and I've had people do that too, say every one of them is 10, but I just want you to assess them. So with that said, and this is kind of, and if you want to give a story why you give a number, you're welcome to give that background. So the first item is scheduling. On a 1 to 10 basis, how important do you think scheduling is?
I would say an 8.
Okay.
And I think because you got to have the logical thought to know where you are going. You've got to have the plan.
Estimating.
What the 3 keys for project management, the trifecta there is what? Schedule, cost, and scope. I give that an 2. Yeah, absolutely. You got to be able to put the dollars to it, to know, the world runs by dollars. So if you don't have a good way to estimate, you got to find a way to get the right numbers for it.
What about contracts, the physical contract?
Also an 8, because that's your guidance to whoever. In fact, that may even be a 10, because it's essentially your scope of work, right? And in a lot of respects, it's what are you expected to do? What am I expected to do? And it's a fundamental communication tool. And I found that in my career, 95% of all problems are fundamentally a communication issue, not some other problem. It's not a material. It's not it's fundamentally communication or lack thereof.
What about administration of that contract?
Well, once you say in a contract what you're going to do, you got to abide by what you say. And I've, in my career, many times, the most embarrassing thing is when somebody says, "Hey, your contract says you do this, and you haven't done it, and you have no idea it's in the contract." So you have to adhere to what you say you're going to do. So in order to do that, you got to be vigilant as to what your obligations are.
Design.
I'd say design, I'd probably give it an 8. I think you could have, and the reason I say that is obviously you got to design something to build it. But if you get 3 engineers in a room and ask them to design the same thing, you're probably going to get 3 different perspectives. Mm-hmm. And so design is important. Getting the design is probably equally important, and then executing it is probably most important. But there are a number of ways to solve any problem. It's defining what's the way you're going to go and then committing to it.
Accounting.
Kind of goes with contracts and kind of goes with money. And as I said earlier, the 3 things I've learned in any organization that you got to know are people, how the money flows, and then what your contractual obligations are. So you've got to, especially in the project management arena, you've got to know where your money is, when it's coming in, when it's going out, and what it's going to. I think, and in my public service career, the flow of money being taxpayer dollars, you had to know. You had to know where you were at.
Business development, otherwise known as selling.
Right. Maybe a little on the public sector side, but more certainly on the private sector is if you're going to find, you got to have somebody dedicated to go find the work. It's not an associated duty or additional duty in my mind. Somebody has to be out there looking for the work and have a certain skill set to do that. You know, I'm not sure I know many engineers that are engineers that make good business developers, but it goes along with that being able to talk with people on an individual or overall, group basis. You know, any engineer can be a business developer, but they got to be confident in their ability to articulate and talk. So absolutely, you got to have business development, and it's a unique skill set. There are people that are really, really good with that, and there are people that are really, really not good at conversation. Yeah. You don't want those people trying to carry the torch for your company.
And I think I already know the answer to this last one, but I'll ask it anyhow. Leadership. Absolutely.
You know, when you sent me the list of the questions beforehand, I thought, okay, we just go right to number 9. You know, that to me, that's a 20. That's a 20 because you can't, you know, people, you don't have to be a charismatic person to be a strong leader. You got to understand what kind of leader you are, but you fundamentally have to be able to make the decisions and have the skill set, and more than anything else, care about what you're doing and care about the people that are doing it. And so I think, how many large companies that we have seen that have failed, and you go, they had a good product. What did they do wrong? And it was fundamentally, I think, a failure of leadership. You know, a failure of thinking strategically. You know, what's the future? We may not like it, but you know, online media is huge, and I guess what I mean by that is, you know, you look at some of the companies that just haven't been able to react to the changes in the environment, and to me, that's a failure of leadership.
You know, the funny thing.
And can I add one thing to that? The other part of leadership that's so very important is ethical leadership. You know, how many folks have you heard of basically didn't behave themselves, great leaders, but did that just, you go, why would they screw up their career and their reputation by doing something stupid, ethically? And I've got no time for, you know, no tolerance for unethical, even if they're great leaders. Fundamental that you got to be true to yourself and people that you're around, and you know, if your leadership style is deceive and overcome and all about yourself, eventually will catch up with you. But it still comes down to failure of leadership.
And you hit on a topic really near and dear to my heart about like ethics. Obviously we work in an industry that is a challenge. I'll just leave it as that. but we
Mm-hmm.
work in a very very ethically challenged industry, and it's good to know we have some other people out there. I was also going to comment on your concept of leadership. You were talking about decide what kind of leader you're going to be. Now, my youngest son is an extreme introvert, and obviously I'm not. So, because of that, he had said, I can't imagine ever being the president of the company or CEO of the company. And I said, why? And he goes, well, me and you are so different. Um, and I couldn't lead that way. And I was like, well, one of the guys that we're going to interview in the very near future is Stephen Gray. He's the CEO of a $1 billion corporation in Lexington, Kentucky, and he's an introvert. And if you talk with him, you figure it out really quick. He's an introvert, but
Mm-hmm.
he still can be a leader. So, and he's still a leader. Everybody has their own way they can lead.
You're and absolutely right. I could say very much in my career, I was an introvert, and you know, but you sort of learn the skills and you adapt to what you need to do. I remember being scared to death standing up in front and doing a presentation, and now I can in front of people. So it's skill sets that are learned. But I think the key there is it doesn't matter whether you're charismatic, introvert, extroverted. Is if you understand how you are, but have a fundamental desire to lead and influence, there's a way for you to be successful. There is no doubt in my mind.
Well, I want to close this out. I want to, of course, give you the last word, but I want to close it out. And first of all, I want to thank you. First of all, thank you for your service. I thank you for your contribution to you worked in not only for the National Guard, but worked in the public sector, heavily involved in making the world we live in a better place. And I want to thank you for that. I mean, anybody who does that much time in any branch of service has plenty of war stories and pretty difficult times to talk about. And I just want to commend you. People don't realize how difficult it can be to do those type of things, but they can be extremely difficult. And I just want to commend you for that. And I want to commend you for your career. Very few people have been there and done that like you have. You've had some very interesting assignments and very interesting responsibilities in your career, and I think personally ASU should hire you back. So, because I think
I'd
there's a
love to
lot of young
teach
people out
again.
there could learn a lot from you. So, and as I said, I want to give you the last word.
I think, well, one, thank you for the opportunity. Uh, just the ability, we're doing podcasts and reaching out to I think is huge, and the ability to influence. And I hope that, I guess my last word is, I hope something that I said, most people only remember 5% of what you say over the course of an hour. I hope there was something that I said that maybe one of your listeners kind of picked up on and thought, oh, you know what? That's something I hadn't thought about, but that's a good idea. And if that's the case, then I'm thrilled to have done this, that maybe somewhere out there, one of your listeners, I've been able to influence them or given them a thought of something that they might have not thought about themselves.
Well, thank you once again, and if it's okay, I'll call you General. And thank you once again, I wish you well. Tune in next week for another podcast from CONEXEC.